לכולם, ברוכים הבאים לסמינר המחלקתי של המחלקה לתולדות ישראל על שם קושיצקי, סמינר המחלקתי על שם הפרופסור יהושע קניאל זיכרונו לברכה. We have today a unique privilege to hear a world-renowned historian, and here it's not with exaggeration that I use the term, Professor Richard Pipes, Professor Emeritus from Harvard University, and his dear wife Irene Pipes is here. They are here because they have dedicated, as of yesterday, a chair dedicated to the research on the history and culture of Polish Jews in memory of Mrs. Pipes' parents, Marcel and Maria Roth. And we thought it was fitting that the first activity of the chair would be a lecture by Professor Pipes. Professor Richard Pipes is one of the most eminent historians of Russia and the Soviet Union. He's published over 20 books, numerous articles. Those of us of a certain age remember in graduate school reading books such as Russia Under the Old Regime, which our teachers would have us read, many of them because they wanted us to agree with Pipes, but also not too few who wanted to use Pipes as a foil to show why they thought he was wrong. But whatever the case was, Pipes was someone that one could not ignore when dealing with the history of Russia and the Soviet Union. Professor Pipes is also, unlike many of us academics, a person who was involved in policy making in the United States government and the National Security Council, helped define American policy towards the Soviet Union. But to go back to Professor Pipes as a historian, we can learn many things from him, from his many writings, but if I had to put it in a few short sentences, I would say Professor Pipes taught us to see continuity even in the midst of revolution, but also to see the possibilities for revolution even in the midst of what seemed to be continuity. In the course of his long career, Professor Pipes made a few rare appearances in trying to deal with Jewish history. One of them was an article he published in the journal called then Soviet Jewish Affairs, now called East European Jewish Affairs, in 1975. Hard to believe, 37 years ago, about Catherine II and the Jews. For those of us who read that article at the time, and my students who I forced to read since, this was a, how should I say, a kind of dose of cold water. In certain ways, the opening of the article is a kind of indictment of the whole field of Jewish history and its approach to, in this case, history of the Jews of Russia and Russian policy towards the Jews. But after you get past the first couple paragraphs of that article, there is a stimulating and challenging argument made, in this case, about Catherine II. And I don't think I'm exaggerating if I would say that this article engendered many new avenues of research on the history of Russian Jewry. If we look at the work of people such as Michael Stanislavski, the late John Clear, Hans Roger, and many other people who have written about different aspects of Russian policy towards Jews, we see the echoes and influence of this cry made by Professor Richard Pipes back in 1975. Almost as a kind of bookend, 30 years later, Professor Pipes weighed in his usual very serious and thoughtful way, about another controversial issue, and that was the book published by Alexander Solzhenitsyn about Russians and Jews, the book called 200 Years Together, which is a whole series of reviews. The book itself has never appeared in full English translation. But Professor Pipes, in a long review of the New Republic, tried to deal with the central question of this anti-Semitism of Solzhenitsyn, who, by the way, was no big fan of Professor Pipes, and wrote and spoke about that. But actually, in a surprising way, Professor Pipes absolves Solzhenitsyn, at least in this book, of the charge of anti-Semitism. And as a kind of memento of your visit here today, Professor Pipes, I wanted to give you a copy of a journal which is published here at Bar-Ilan. It's one of the great secrets of Bar-Ilan University, a journal called Common Knowledge, which is one of the finest intellectual journals that I know of anywhere. And it has an editorial board that would be the envy of any journal in the world. And actually here in 2003, there was published a long excerpt from Solzhenitsyn's book on the Jews in English. So you don't need it, but at least to show you at Bar-Ilan, people were sensitive to the need for this, so I'd like you to have this today. And to go back to our speaker for today, again, we've learned a great deal from Professor Pipes as a historian of Russia. Those of us who were trained also in Russian and Polish history, we couldn't avoid running across his writings, his books. And as I said, I make my students read this article of Professor Pipes about Catherine II and the Jews. Years ago, when I published a book for the Open University in this course on Polin, there is translated as one of the appendices Professor Pipes' article about Catherine II and the Jews, because I thought his view was so important. Please. Today we have the... Yes, Professor Stampfer.
I'm just curious, what led you all of a sudden to write about Catherine and the Jews? Your article came out of the blue, and we were all waiting for part 2 that never came. So there must be a story.
Well, I'm afraid I'm almost 89 years old. I'll be 89 in July. And my memory is not what it used to be. I was asked this when I arrived here, why I wrote this article, the only article I've really ever written about Jews, and I don't remember. I just don't remember. It may have been something I've read. I have the complete set of Dubnov in 10 volumes in German, and I have many other books about Russian Jews. I have a whole section in my library, and maybe something I read in there, and I was upset by the fact that the Jewish historians did not allow for the fact that Russia at the time, at the 18th century, was not an egalitarian society, but society divided into estates. Each estate has its duties, its restrictions, and some privileges. And the Jews fitted into that structure. And probably that is what motivated me to write it. But I did not intend to write a second part to it. This was meant to be one time.
We were hoping. Any other questions? Yes, Professor Stampfer.
I'm just curious, what led you all of a sudden to write about Catherine and the Jews? Your article came out of the blue, and we were all waiting for part 2 that never came. So there must be a story.
Well, I'm afraid I'm almost 89 years old. I'll be 89 in July. And my memory is not what it used to be. I was asked this when I arrived here, why I wrote this article, the only article I've really ever written about Jews, and I don't remember. I just don't remember. It may have been something I've read. I have the complete set of Dubnov in 10 volumes in German, and I have many other books about Russian Jews. I have a whole section in my library, and maybe something I read in there, and I was upset by the fact that the Jewish historians did not allow for the fact that Russia at the time, at the 18th century, was not an egalitarian society, but society divided into estates. Each estate has its duties, its restrictions, and some privileges. And the Jews fitted into that structure. And probably that is what motivated me to write it. But I did not intend to write a second part to it. This was meant to be one time.
We were hoping. Any other questions? If not, I will. Yes, Professor Rossman.
Usually, Jewish historians portray Catherine's policy as contradictory, and you also allude in the article to some contradictions, the double taxation. the fact that she still expected the Kahal to enforce certain laws and collect taxes among the Jews. Also, there were some efforts to expel Jews from villages in 2 of the provinces in the 1770s. So,
Why was she contradictory?
I'm sorry?
You are asking why she conducted conviction.
Well, how do you see this?
Well, it's very, as I say, she was in a very insecure position. So she had to abide by the laws passed by her predecessor, Elizabeth. She had to cater to the church, although she wasn't particularly religious. She had to cater to the merchants. So she had to do things she didn't particularly care to do, but that was just the reality of politics. And if I think that if she were a legitimate ruler who ascended the throne legitimately, the way her predecessor did, I think she would have greatly eased the condition of the Jews. But she wasn't. She was an usurper. Many people disliked her. Her son hated her, Paul, who became Tsar for a few years after her death. And she had to continuously make concessions. And that's the reason for the contradiction. I mean, all politics rests on contradictions. You look today at President Obama, you look at the president I served, President Reagan, they have to constantly make concessions of various kinds to groups which oppose them. And she was in a particularly vulnerable position.
Yes, please.
When you look at Tsarist Russia, many of the leaders, at least from a Jewish perspective, leave something to be desired. But what is your own personal opinion of Catherine the Great? Do you consider her one of the better leaders from a Jewish perspective then?
Not only from the Jewish perspective, I would say she was probably the best ruler Russia had, because she passed all kinds of very liberal laws. The 1780, I've written an article about 1785 charter, which was published only in Russia, not in America, of which I explained how important it was. It's the first time in Russian history that Russians, it's true a select group, but any Russians, received rights and had no duties. They did not have to serve. Now the law that the Russian nobles didn't have to serve was passed actually by her husband, Peter III, but she confirmed it. And she gave them the right to own land, which they didn't own before. So, although this was not extended to the other groups of the population, it marked for the first time in Russia that a group could say, we have rights, which we did not exist before. She was basically tolerant of criticism. She had only at least until the French Revolution. I think the French Revolution scared her terribly. And with 1790 she began to repress. Novikov and others were repressed because she was terribly afraid of the influence of French ideas. By the way, one of the reasons limitations were imposed on Jewish merchants was because she was afraid after 1789 that those smuggled books from the West, which would incite the Third Estate. They were Meshani, and the Third Estate is what made the French Revolution. But on the whole, I cannot think of any. Well, Alexander II would be my next choice, but those are my favorite rulers. But she is definitely my favorite ruler.
Anyone else? Please.
I'm sorry. My question is, Catherine in 90s, I suppose was not physically Catherine in 60s and 70s when she wrote her nakaz. How do you say nakaz in English?
Instruction.
Instruction.
Yeah.
But was she physically capable in these last years of her life to deal in these details and all these issues? Or this was some of her administrators who managed it?
Well, I think to the very end, her mind was fine. Yeah. But you have to consider the influence of the French Revolution. She became very illiberal after 1789, and she was afraid of ideas coming from the West and became very repressive. But that was not her inclination, it was just the conditions of what she feared the French Revolution meant the end of civilization as we knew it. And if it's spread to Europe, and particularly to Russia, that'll be barbarism will triumph. But, well, of course, I mean, she had a huge empire to administer. She relied on her ministers. But her mind was okay, I think, to the very end.
Anyone else? I want to use the privilege as chairman to ask a couple of things. You spoke about Catherine's fear after the French Revolution, but very often we portray Catherine as being very much in the tradition of enlightened absolutism of that time. And the reforms that you spoke of seem to be what she even says in the placard. She says about the worrying about the best interests of the people, the happiness of the inhabitants, including the Jews. So was this genuine on her part? Or was it just, on the surface?
No, it was absolutely very genuine. She was a Western woman raised in the spirit of enlightenment. She read the Enlightenment philosophers, and I see no reason to doubt that she was genuine. But the fear which the French Revolution struck in her made her reject these ideas and say, no, now we have to retrench, and we have to prevent these ideas from entering Russia. And she became very reactionary in many ways.
And another thing, which you've written about in various forms is what we would call the nationalities question in Russia, or in the Soviet Union as well. Is her policy on the Jews, do you see it as part of a larger policy, or how? Is it different, the same, from the policy in dealing with these vast territories that she conquered or inherited? How does Jewish policy fit into the larger Russian nationalities policy?
Well, in the 18th century, you had no nationality problem. I mean, there was a Polish problem, perhaps, but there was nothing else. The nationality problem, on which I've written my first book, The Formation of the Soviet Union, became a problem really only in the second half of the 19th century. When nationalism rose in the Ukraine, among the Muslims, among the Georgians, people of Central Asia and so on. But in her reign, this was not a problem. I mean, I cannot think of any nationality except the Poles being a problem, because the Poles wanted their independence restored. Poles had a history as old as Russian history, and they wanted independence. But nobody else in Russia was clamoring for independence. I mean, the Baltic areas, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians were not clamoring for anything. The Jewish problem was a very special problem, as it was in the most of Europe, because you had a minority which the church despised, because, as I quoted Elizabeth, she didn't want to profit from the enemies of Christ. And that was a very special problem. But other than that, there was no real nationality problem. That only emerged in the second half of the 19th century, particularly the beginning of the 20th.
And you spoke about the kind of overall view of Catherine, and also her intentions. Very often we talk about the difference between intentions and then execution of the policies, and of course the bureaucracy involved can also sabotage not just the merchants and others. But I wonder, we spoke about the origins of the Pale of Settlement. And you said in the article, and you said again today, that part of his intention is to open up opportunities for the Jews, to let them settle in these new territories. Eventually we have the big center in Odessa, which is a product of that policy. But in the long run, I mean, many people have said this, and I don't know if you agree, so I'd like to hear your viewpoint, that in the long run, the Pale of Settlement was probably the most injurious thing of Russian policy towards the Jews, and also injurious to Russia in many ways. And people have pointed out, for example, if you look a number of artisans in a province in the Pale of Settlement, and then just across the border, outside the Pale of Settlement, there aren't enough artisans. So a kind of natural development of economy would have them move, but they couldn't, because and it was harmful to Russia as a whole. So, with all the good intentions, was the Pale of Settlement something really injurious and destructive?
It certainly was injurious and very fatal for Jews. But it was forced on her largely by Russian merchants who said, we cannot compete with these people. They're smugglers, they don't pay taxes, and so on and so forth, and they work together with each other to outwit us Russian merchants, and she had very little choice. So it was imposed on her by the merchant class.
yeah, I mean, we remember the circumstances where it even started like a kind of lawsuit to the Senate.
Yeah.
Complaints by merchants in Moscow.
That's right.
And so, but you've worked with presidents, Professor Pipes, and, it gives us pause to think, how much power do people in power have? I mean, you've seen presidents, and not just written about emperors. Are they really? I mean, you presented Catherine. She was forced. What kind of limitations are there?
I mean, every politician, from the highest to the lowest, has to contend with society at large, even if he has absolute rule. The way Russian rulers work. I mean, they were самодержавцы. They had no institutions no constitutions, no laws, no parliaments to deal with. They could do whatever they wanted, theoretically. But in practice, every politician has to deal with the society which he or she rules. And I assume you're referring to President Reagan, for whom I worked.
Yes.
He too had to take into account society over which he presided. And I remember once being in the Oval Office, and I remember two of his chief advisors asking him to raise taxes. We need more money. And he says, and he got very angry, which he rarely did, says, I will not raise taxes, period. And so he too, because he knew that would be fatal to his chances for re-election.
Well, he did raise taxes in the end.
Yes, but he didn't have to be re-elected. This was in the first term. So nobody is an absolute ruler, really. Even Peter the Great had to constantly deal with the old believers and so on. Every head of state has to deal with the society over which he rules, or the society will rebel, or he'll be assassinated. What some of them did. I mean, Paul I, Catherine's child, was assassinated because he was ruling so erratically, and they couldn't take it.
I guess one last question I'd like to ask you, Professor Pipes, and relating to Catherine and everything else, is a larger question that you've dealt with in many different ways in your writings, and that is the kind of special nature of Russian history as opposed to other European nations. And in a sense, that alludes to one of the big questions in Russian history about Westernization or Russianization or Slavicization of Russian history. So is it kind of doomed to failure, any kind of attempt, starting from Catherine and going up to our day, a real Westernization of Russia?
Well, I've studied this subject many ways, and I've studied public opinion polls. The thing that's striking about Russia is that the vast majority of Russians don't give a damn about politics. They're only concerned with their family and their friends and the locality in which they live. They are not socialized and they are not politicized. They're concerned only with their own little enclave in which they live. Therefore, what the government does not concern them. And that means the government can do almost anything it wants. They want a strong ruler. They want to maintain order. If you ask Russians in public opinion polls, what's more important for you? Svoboda, freedom, or порядок, order? One poll, which I've read, says 84% say порядок, order. Now, order and freedom are not contradictory. I mean, we in America, and I'm sure you in Israel, you have both order and freedom. But for the Russian, they are contradictory. You either have order or you have freedom. If you have order, you don't have freedom. If you have freedom, you don't have order. Freedom to Russian is chaos, anarchy, democracy. If you ask Russians about democracy, it's chaos. Everybody does what they want. Because Belinsky, there's a wonderful quotation from Belinsky, I don't happen to have it here, but Belinsky, the Russian literary critic of the 1830s, 1840s, said, or wrote, that when the Russian people are given freedom, they will not go to parliament and vote. They'll go to the kabak, to the tavern, to smash everything, drink, get themselves drunk, and beat up everybody, and steal everything. So for the Russians, democracy of freedom, political freedom, personal freedom, means chaos and crime. And you can't overcome this. This is so deeply rooted in their national psyche. from experience that it's very difficult to overrule. Maybe 30, 40 years of peace and order will change their mind, but right now I'm very pessimistic about the next 10, 20 years.
One last thing I think I wanted to ask you also. Professor Pipes wrote a fascinating autobiography. It's recommended for you to read. It's called Vixie, Memoirs of a Non-Belonger. And it's just a fascinating book. But one thing, you know, here I'm being named to hold a chair on Polish history. How much does your Polish history and background have an impact on your scholarship, your views of Russia in particular, or your views of the United States or Israel for that matter?
Well, I appreciate what you're saying because, for example, Solzhenitsyn said that I have a Polish view of Russian history.
I was alluding to that, yes.
It's a very interesting thing that the closer you are to another country, the better you understand it. The farther you are, the more you romanticize it. So Europeans romanticize Indians, American Indians. Americans don't romanticize Indians. They think they are lazy, they are drunkards, they are thieves. But in Europe, Karl May wrote these wonderful books about, German books about the American Indians. Americans tend to romanticize Russians. You know, Chekhov, Gogol, Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky. But we Poles lived very close to them. I was not interested in Russia when I was in Poland. My culture was entirely German. My father was raised in Vienna, and my first language was German. Until I was 5, 6 years old, I spoke German only. Then when I went to school, I learned Polish. But I wasn't interested in Russian history at all. But somehow I absorbed a Polish view of Russia. How, I don't know. When my Russian of the Old Regime came out, I was told, and it was written in the reviews, that I'm a follower of Jan Kucharzewski, who wrote a famous book, a series of books, called Od Białego Caratu do Czerwonego, from white tsardom to red tsardom, where he shows the continuity of Russian history from the Tsars to the Commissars. How I absorbed it, I don't know, because I never read any books on Russia. When I was a student in Poland, I was 16 when the war broke out, I read Nietzsche, I read Heine. I never read, I don't think, any Russians. But somehow, it must have been in the air. So I suppose it is a Polish approach, but it's also a realistic approach. I think we Poles understood Russia very well.
You wrote there that your father was one of Pilsudski's legionnaires.
Yes, true.
And it was your great-grandfather that was one of the leaders of the, this is for our Jewish historians here, his great-grandfather, I think, was one of the leaders of the congregation in Lvov that invited Abraham Cohen to become the liberal rabbi, and then this rabbi unfortunately was poisoned.
Correct.
But there are various stations in the history of Jews in Eastern Europe, even if Professor Pipes was not a scholar of Jewish history, but his family involvement, biography, autobiography, and his insights into the history of Eastern Europe, I think, are important and crucial for all of us who deal with the area. I think we've learned the lesson of your indictment of the field of Jewish history from that article from 1975, and I think that if you take the time to read some of the books that have been written by Jewish historians in the past couple of decades, you'll see that I don't think we deserve any more, at least, the indictment that you wrote in 1975, but it was an indictment from which I think was a wake-up call, and many of us learned and appreciated. So I thank you again for your words today, and again, it was very appropriate that you opened the activities of the Marcel and Maria Roth Chair for the Study of Polish Jewry by giving your lecture and being with us today. So I thank you very much.
Thank you.